Hi, this is the first part of our mini lecture series on private care agreements. The first slide looks at the definition of a private care agreement. It is the transfer of a significant asset, usually the family home, in exchange for promise of care and support. You'll note that it also says that many private agreements are quite informal and people don't realize they're there. Yet there are many points in which we can catch private care agreements, either in financial institutions, in our social work environments, in the health environments, if we know some of the right questions to ask. Moving to the second slide, which is Introduction to Private Care Agreements, part of the challenge is that they may seem ideal at the beginning, but very often private care agreements do go wrong. They're not very well thought through. People may find themselves very unhappy in the situation, and the caregivers can also be very vulnerable. You may get yourself into a situation as a caregiver where you feel that you've promised to do something that you actually just can't do. And we see this as declining health happens to older adults. Sometimes it can lead to cases of neglect. Sometimes it means that a new thought process has to happen. So there's vulnerabilities both on the side of the caregiver and on the person who receives care. Older adults are people who are most likely to want a private care agreement. They tend to be at the bequest or the behest of older adults, and really it tends to be about fear of institutional care. Moving on to the fourth slide, some may be fearful of the cost of home care. They may have had a family member or friend be provided with home care by a family member, and so that they learn about it in this way. Older adults may not be aware of other community supports and housing. And it can seem like an ideal and tidy little situation to have your son or daughter or niece or nephew move in with you in exchange for the care. Moving on to slide 5. Some of the problems are associated. Older adults who own their family home very often in Canada really have that as their main asset. And if the private care agreement breaks down, they can lose their assets, which means they may actually face impoverishment. Caregivers themselves, we talked about briefly, may be vulnerable for loss of compensation. They may legitimately have given up other paid work or other housing options to do this. So the degree of vulnerability is exceedingly high. Some of the problems, you'll see that most of them are informal and often undocumented. They've often been made without legal advice, and there's often this sort of broad notion of a promise to care without sort of clear understandings of what those things may need to be. Because of the intimate relationship typically between the private caregiver and the older adult, that may make them increasingly vulnerable to forms of abuse and neglect. The older adult may feel like they made their own bed, or they may feel like they can't complain against the care that their family member or friend is giving them, and as a result they may find themselves in situations which they can't be in control of. They can't make the person leave. Other problems, relationships can deteriorate. Upfront payment in terms of the transfer of property can lead to the older adult being evicted from their own home. So if the older adult does transfer the property in advance or at the time of the care agreement occurring, what can happen is if the younger relative, son, daughter, niece, nephew, friend, then decides that they want to sell the house, the older adult has almost no way of stopping that from happening. Increasing care needs of the older adult may simply make the care relationship inappropriate. It can be a good idea in some cases. So I'm not saying that they're always a bad idea. They're not inherently exploitative. They are, however, very, very vulnerable and often not through. They can commonly degenerate into abusive financial relationships. Moving to slide 9 on the law of private care agreements, it's important to know that the common law is quite inconsistent in this area. There's the law of contracts and the law of gifts that can apply. There's also, as we'll talk about in a little bit, the idea of a constructive trust. What you need to know is, once you get into a private care agreement, it's difficult and expensive to try to get out of it. Under the law of contract, there is a transfer of property in exchange for a promise to care that can make a contract. But if it's not written down anywhere, it's very difficult to prove sometimes. Contracts don't require there be written in format in order to exist. You can have an oral contract, but again, the proof of that contract can be very difficult. And you would need to bring an action for breach of the contract, which again requires going to court, hiring a lawyer. All of these things may be actually quite impractical. There may not be money to do it. People may not be able to find the remedy, and often many older adults are very embarrassed that they got themselves in this situation. The remedy for it could be some damages, so you might not get your house back, but you might get money, which would help to offset that problem. That's either for the caregiver or for the person who's receiving care. Again, really difficult to actually practically get these things done. Common law of gift, if it's interpreted as a gift, then it's more revocable, which means you can undo it much easier, but again, it's incredibly difficult to prove that this is the case. You can have the gift set aside on slide 13 on the basis of undue influence, which is what it sounds like, that the person was unduly pressured or influenced into doing this. You can have it done on unconscionability grounds, which means it's so patently unfair to keep the gift in the place that it was that sort of no reasonable person would think that they should. A resulting trust, you can have it set aside, which means that essentially the property is being held in a special protected kind of environment, and so whether or not it was given away in its sort of physical or legal form, the right of the use of it or the right for a person to reside in the house is still protected. And you can also have compensation on the basis that a person has been unjustly enriched. So if a person gets way more than would be reasonable, then you can have it set aside. I emphasize that these are legal terms that you could get done. The reality is most private care agreements can't be undone that easily. We'll now move on to the next mini lecture.